Hello and welcome to the Forest School podcast. I am Lewis. I'm joined later in the episode by Wem Sutherland. We are also joined in this episode by Alex and Casey from the Completely Arbortrary podcast, a show where they talk about a different species of tree every week. And so we thought Alex and Casey would be the perfect people to come in and talk to us about a discussion that Wem and I have had loads about. What does it mean to know trees as a species versus knowing them as an individual, and what are the pros and cons and different benefits? You can find out more about that by listening to today's episode. But before we get into that, I want to say if you're listening to this in December, you can visit the link in the show notes and you can get your hand on the Magic in the Mud t-shirts. We are selling these only in December. We're going to get them all printed up in January. So if you don't get your orders in December, that's it. The shirt is gone. We're not ever printing them again. So follow the links in the show notes, grab yourself something, and then you'll get a little present in January that will cheer you up in, the darker months. Thank you as always to everybody that's sponsoring us on Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/The Forest School Podcast or visit theforestschoolpodcast.com. If you're enjoying the podcast and you want to support us, we really, really do appreciate it. And without any more delays, let's get into this chat with Alex and Casey. Evening here. It is minus temperatures.
Really? It's that cold?
Would have worn more presentable attire, but no, you've got big hoodie.
Yeah, no, I'm wearing like my biggest sweater right now.
Yeah.
Are you wearing gloves even?
Yes, indoors.
Wow. Oh my God.
Hi everybody. We're here with Casey and Alex, who, if you don't know, we're very excited because Wem and I are both big fans of their podcast. I'm going to get a real English pronunciation of it. You ready? Completely Arbortrary. Arbortrary.
Man, I was really hoping for the arbitrary, like really jam the last little section together.
Arbitrary?
Arbitrary.
Yes,
which is even,
arbitrary. How about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great.
Very proper. Thank you.
And I can look. I don't know if you can see. Oh, people watching video can see behind me. I don't know if you recognize these.
Yep.
It's my little collection.
I sure do.
That has just snuck in the background.
I just love it.
You have to explain what those are, Lewis, for people who can't watch.
Okay, Wem said before we started recording, Wem was like, you have to remember people don't know them like you know them. So I'm pointing at some. Do you want me to plug for you? I'm a Tremium member, which means
there we go.
I support the Completely Arbortrary podcast, and I get cool stickers that go on my big old lunchbox, and I get these Cone of the Month things, and also I can ask them AMAs every month, and I can do all the
exactly.
And your merch shop as well, and all this. Listen, this is just
wow.
Yeah,
thing.
you get all that cool stuff. Yeah, thanks. Could you just record another one of those, and we're gonna put it on as an ad for us each time?
Yeah. But for listeners who don't know your podcast, can you tell us a little bit about the podcast and why you began it?
Yeah, you want to start, Alex?
Oh, sure. Well, we host a podcast called Completely Arbortrary. It's a weekly show. It is about trees and other related topics. So what that means is that every episode we talk about one species of tree, and then we dovetail that into a conversation about some grander story around it. This is usually, by the way, there's this big asterisk next to all of this.
Sometimes we just sit down and we're like, all right, what do we have to talk about right now?
Yeah. But Casey miraculously has come up with 190 topics to talk about 190 trees over the last 4 years. Those topics range from history to culture and religion and cuisine and art and music. It's kind of all over the place in a good way, I think, to where even if you aren't particularly interested in that species of tree, you will learn something interesting about that tree to share with your friends.
Yeah.
And I should add that ideally, ideally, it's also it's what I call low stakes science. Whenever I tell people about it, where it's not like you need to be paying attention and on all the time. There's some really great podcasts out there about plants, but they're talking really scientifically, looking over all these intense papers and talking to the authors. They know these things backwards and forwards. And if you miss something, I'm like, oh, what was that? What was the study that you just said? I can't keep track. And this is like, just come on in, just sit on down, grab a coffee, and just listen. You're not gonna really find anything that's mind blowing, other than like, oh, here's this interesting story. But you don't need to have a PhD to listen to the show. You don't need to even be a botany kind of person. It's just kind of like, hey, here's a connection you might have not known about. And also, here's a good excuse for Casey to talk about this thing that he's been interested in for no good reason.
Well, that's what I was going to say. One of the things that's really nice about the podcast is just hearing people talk passionately about anything. I will sit and listen to. It doesn't really matter the topic. So the fact that it's trees, and I'm also into trees, is like,
It works.
Yeah,
double whammy.
and the dynamic between you guys works very well because Casey, I mean, Alex, I feel like you have also become a tree nerd over the time that I've listened to the podcast. But at the beginning, the whole sort of setup was that Casey, you're like the tree geek, and you're explaining to Alex, and then that sort of puts us as the listeners at ease in that, as you say, that kind of, it's all casual. We're just listening to somebody explain to their mate about this thing, and we get to join in that journey. But Alex, you're kind of losing that now because you're like full of like wisdom and knowledge now. And
I have evolved.
We need to get a third.
Yeah, somebody who really doesn't know anything about trees. And then we just continue this pattern until we have like 15 hosts.
All right in one room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be amazing. And so we wanted to chat with you guys, not just to kind of plug your show and do all of the Trivia member things, but also because we wanted to talk about this idea. And actually, Wem and I have had this discussion backwards and forwards about what the different like benefits, pros and cons. What does it mean to learn about a species of tree versus learning, like knowing a tree as an individual, as an individual. Oh, I was going to say entity, and then I started thinking about the big aspen forests. But I mean the stupid trees with the loopholes. I think
Finally, someone said it.
Yeah, yeah. This is it. Now we're now anti-tree. We are.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you.
The difference between knowing tree as a species and tree as an individual, because I'm a big believer of tree as an individual.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you guys are obviously coming more from this kind of like trees as a species. This is the kind of interesting jam. So was there, what do you think kind of draws you to like trees as a species, as a lens?
This is a good question. I'll kind of start, Alex, but I want to make sure that you get your opinion in here because this is one other thing, Wem, that is really nice about Alex and I. Me coming from this one kind of scientific background where I've showed or done a bunch of schooling and I've tried to figure all these things out. I do a lot of research. And then Alex has done none of that, and not in a negative way, but sometimes I'm like, oh, no, but most of the time it really lets Alex come with a fresh perspective on things. So half the time, that's usually how a show ends. I'm like, Alex, look at all these interesting things. And then his response is like, actually, it's pretty dumb and pointless. And I'm like, oh, yeah, oh, okay,
well,
good point. Did I do that? And then he always says, okay, let me add some to it. No. I'm just having a little fun here, Alex.
This is what happens every time we go on another podcast. It's like couples counseling. We have somebody else in the room. We get to really air our grievances.
Exactly. Like we're talking to you, but really I'm talking to Alex.
Right.
No, it's just a really good perspective. So in terms of that kind of question about species versus individuals, I think one thing about the show that I've certainly learned is the distinction between the two kind of starts to melt away when you look closely. And we've talked about it a few different times on the podcast. And one of the kind of situations we always think about is taking like Pando. You brought up the giant aspen in Utah. It's one clonal species or one clonal individual, all connected by roots theoretically. And each of the individuals appears, for all intents and purposes, as its own tree. So I would pose a question to Alex. Well, what if we just like clipped off one of those trees and we planted it somewhere else, and the rest of them just completely died? We burned them all up in a forest. We destroyed it, turned it into a mine. It's gone. Is that tree still the same tree? Or what if we did that like 2 or 3 times? Do we have now 3 individuals, but they're all genetically the same? And now, yeah, they're clones. Okay, we do clones all the time. We do that with any apple tree you've ever seen that's the same. You know, every gala apple is always going to be a clone of the other. And then if a tree walks is another thing we've talked about, this idea that a branch gets laid down and then gets covered in snow. The top of the tree dies, but that branch kind of grows up and keeps new. And there's a tree in Norway, I think it's a Norway spruce that's, I think, what is it? It's little Chico, something like that. Chico.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's a Norwegian word that is very difficult for us to pronounce. But it's the same idea. It's like the tree's actually moving slowly but surely, and it's like 10,000 years old. But the thing that I have also noticed is with the idea of species, it's very kind of centric on animals, where we're really units in and of ourselves. I can walk around different than all three of you, and that's the same for all three of you compared to me. Where trees and nature things don't really quite seem to see it that way, especially if you consider their fungal networks or if they all graft together. And like the individual that we see, that one stem, it really kind of falls apart if you keep looking deeper and deeper and deeper. It's not a law by any means. So I always I think that it's helpful in one regard. How many trees are out there? How many stems? You can count them, right? But then if you're thinking about something on the population level, then it's a lot easier to kind of say, all right, we have like this whole big conglomeration of individuals that we can treat differently. It's almost like kind of like a superorganism of ants. Each one is technically its own individual little thing, but in reality, not. They're all one big unit working towards kind of whatever it is these ants are working towards. So that's my thought. It's hard to pin it down, and I think it comes from where you're what you're going from and what you're going towards. I think is really helpful for that. So if you kind of have an idea, but yeah, what do you think, Alex?
I think I come at it in a slightly different angle. Whereas, Casey spends a lot more time in the field than I do around these trees, and he knows like the nuances, of one tree to the next. And I kind of learn about these trees in a vacuum a little bit. I do spend time in nature, but it's as we've said many times before, I'm a great indoorsman. I'm a bit of an indoor cat. And so when I learn about these trees, I kind of think about them in like archetypes, almost like a character from a sitcom, like that's the nerdy guy or that's the sporty girl. And I see like kind of larger narrative arcs between these trees. So I don't so much think about them as like individuals. I think when we're describing a tree on the podcast, I'm sort of imagining one tree, but it's like the perfect archetypal version of that tree. And then if you asked me to identify another individual of that species and it looked slightly different than what I was used to, I would go, I'm not sure about that. Because there are so many nuances. Like I could try to, I don't want to sell myself short here. I can identify a tree or two.
Right.
But I can identify the ones that are like, this is a dead giveaway, to what this species is. But yeah, I think if you showed me two individuals of a species that look similar but not quite the same, there's some variation in leaf shape or size, or I probably would get a little lost in the weeds there.
Nice.
But yeah, I kind of think of trees in these archetypal roles. It just like, it's cleaner for my brain to understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like learn the archetype, and then you've got the lens to kind of go like, well, now when I see it in, because I always think that habitat plays the biggest role in changing those things. Like the woodland that we're in, quite often, because these trees have grown up in different ways and with different conditions, like you see an oak, and we've got some oaks that are, 40, 50 foot tall, but they're maybe 6 inches across. And it's just because they're because they're in such a dense woodland that it's like they've shot up. Whereas if you opened a textbook and went, how big would a 50-foot oak tree be? Oh, well, it'll be about this. It's going to be, this kind of thing. So you've got to learn the basic bit first, haven't you?
Yeah,
totally. Yeah.
And they're covered are oak trees. You guys can help me with this word because I learnt it and then I promptly forgot it. What is it called when trees aren't getting enough light and they're kind of struggling and they end up with loads of leaves kind of all over their trunk instead of like branches? What's that called?
Those are epicormic sprouts.
Epicormic.
Wow.
Yeah, is that what you're looking for? At least like
Yes,
if it's struggling.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, epicormic.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That is what they're called, which are just buds that are underneath the bark that pop when there's stress often. So usually it's not necessarily if it's getting shaded out. It would happen more often if it gets the top gets knocked off, or if there's decay in the roots or something like that. Some other kind of struggle that it's dealing with, where it essentially is like all hands on deck and freaks out.
Or some sort of trauma, right? Like it gets hit by a car or something.
Yeah, sprouts near that. Or
that's my
some of them
normal
just randomly do
response.
it.
Is just epicormic growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. When we see your feathers and your leaves come out, we're like, okay, all right. Luce is having some
It's
trouble
having
right
a
now.
hand.
What's
And
going
isn't
on?
that like how apple trees work as well? You know, like when we are pruning apple trees to try and get more fruit, we are basically traumatizing them into like, you're going to die soon, so quickly put more shoots out, which is just such a
give us more
sad
fruit.
thought. It's such a sad...
Yeah, isn't it?
Oh
It's
my
sort of
God.
Yeah.
abuse.
It is.
Casey, is this not the same principle of like coppicing?
Yeah.
You like
That is-
chop
it's
a
the
limb
same-
off a tree and it grows a ton of sprouts that you can then harvest for what have you.
Yeah, exactly. For fodder, a lot of people make baskets and things
Sure.
and weave them into chairs. That's what the classic wicker chairs and things are. So I think it's exactly right. And it's a weird question to think about. And you guys had sent over a bit of some notes that I was reading through. And one of the questions is kind of about coppicing. And if we think of trees as individuals, then you're going and cutting the top off an individual and it has to regrow and it's a stress response. And that's, it's a fine way to look at it, but you do have to remember that the tree itself is not necessarily, we add ideas and we like to humanize our plants so that we're able to let people have more of a connection to it. But sometimes if it goes too far and becomes kind of anthropomorphized, it becomes more of an issue where you're adding your own morals to the tree, though it doesn't necessarily have those same things back. For an example is Douglas fir, which you guys have lots of out there, to my understanding. Yeah, it's great. I never think about our native trees being like big ones elsewhere. I never expect to find them, but then, yeah.
Colonization is normally our thing, so...
Yeah, exactly. So hey, take it back. Yeah, rhododendrons I think are super invasive in a lot of the areas. So I think that's it's a little bit of like, take this back.
Yeah.
But the when we anthropomorphize a tree and we add our own kind of moral judgments onto it, or rather we assume it has the same values that we do, then it doesn't really it gives an issue. So again, with the Douglas firs, the idea is, what happens in nature is they'll drop their limbs all the time. So a really old Douglas fir doesn't have any original branches that initially came out when it first started to grow, which are really usually long and very skinny. They will break off at the tree during a big windstorm, and then they'll come back with epicormic growths, just for the same reason we were talking about a second ago. But they're always going to be like these splays of leaves that come out. It kind of does like this if you're looking at it from below. And there's multiple different branches that sprout out. And you end up getting this kind of fan-shaped branch. And then if you look up on a really old tree, one of the old growth ones that we have out here, old growth forests filled with them, all of those new branches with those swept out kind of morphologies, those are all new branches that came after the original branches have already fallen off. So conceivably, one Douglas fir that is 500 years old does not have a single original branch left. They've all broken off and regrown. So if we were to use that same idea with pruning, the tree is like, well, this is what I naturally do. When I get to a certain age, I just regrow my entire canopy. So if we are coppicing or pruning or cutting a tree, the tree's response is, oh, well, this is just normally what I do. It's just how I react to things. So if we top a tree, we can say, well, that's really bad for the tree. But the tree is probably like, this happens all the time. This is kind of what I'm normally used to.
I can't remember which book it is I read. I read something that was saying that a lot of our coppice trees in the UK are still responding to prehistoric mammoth grazing. And the coppicing response of willows and hazels and all those things are, if you then go to areas of Africa or India where there are still elephants, they are predominantly coppice trees still there, because you have to be able to go, somebody's ripped the fuck out of my stems and I've got to be able to come back. and that's still, so it's quite nice then. Again, you say anthropomorphizing, not always great, but I do like to walk around and go, you see that willow tree? Shit scared of elephants, right? and there's none
it's
of them
shaking
here
right now.
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a great idea.
But that's it. Like, it's interesting you say, isn't it, about like anthropomorphizing the tree? Because we, in our work, I feel like I fairly regularly have conversations with people where they've kind of got this like one track, like cutting trees is bad. Like, you must never cut trees. We must save every tree that we can. And it's like a nuanced conversation of like, okay, but if that falls, it takes out 5 healthy trees with it, or if that's just part of the life cycle,
Yeah.
But then, do you think there's a thing, like, do you think you can get the same nature connection through? I'm trying not to make this a combative, like, I believe this and you believe this, and let's fight. Because I'm on this, I'm just exploring the idea of like, would you ever get the same level of nature connection through like species knowledge, or does like human nature connection? Like, do we need an individual to be like, oh, like in our woods we have Big Douglas, who is a Big Douglas fir, who is like, I have that relation to Big Douglas in a way that if I came to the trees out there, I wouldn't go like, oh, a Douglas fir. I am emotionally connected to all Douglas fir trees everywhere.
That's an interesting question, Alex. Yeah, you kind of talked about that a second ago.
Yeah, I feel like I can speak pretty well to that because I always think about my mother. She was an elementary teacher primary school.
Thank you.
Is that the okay? Thank you. Speaking of all this, like learning in a vacuum, I watch a ton of British TV, and I've never been to the UK. So that's my perspective of British culture. But my mother, elementary school teacher for like 30 years, and she always talked about, going to school for education, and you learn from textbooks, and then you might have your lab, as it were, is like shadowing another teacher, teacher's assistant or whatever. And then you go, okay, I graduated, I've got a job, I am prepared to teach these kids. And then you get into the classroom and it's like a fucking nightmare because you have 30 individual children, all with different personalities and skill sets and volumes of their voice, interacting in one small space. And so I think like learning about trees in a vacuum is fine. But then when I go out into nature and I see these trees, I go, oh, it is sort of like the last piece of the puzzle, I feel. And whenever I'm feeling, because I don't think this is a secret. I'm not like inherently interested in these things. I kind of have become more and more, but it's not like a core interest of mine, which is like the whole premise of the show, right? But whenever I'm feeling really detached from the material, if I just go spend some time, like on the coast, in the coastal forests, or the mountain over here, Mount Hood, I do feel like it sort of ties a bow, or like resets me and reminds me of like how important these things are and how beautiful these things are. And it's not just like images on my laptop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that interaction, Alex, is really also important. And it's for me, I think it's a little bit different. Once I learned kind of how to identify and recognize trees, and I just finished writing a whole tree identification book on the idea of the urban trees that you find around our area. And one of the big things that I kind of argued for is that there's a deeper connection that somebody can make with any of the species if you know them just a little bit, if you know their name specifically, because that sets them apart from something else. It sets it apart from other kinds that are just ever so slightly different. And the kind of technical side of that is if you're doing diagnostics as an arborist, you're saying, okay, well, this tree is sick. What's wrong with this tree? Like, how do I manage it? What are my treatments? When you do that, you need to know the name of the species before you can go to the next place, because it's impossible. Well, it's not impossible, but it's very bad practice for you to go look at a tree and say, well, I'm not really sure what this tree is, but I'm just going to say this is probably going to fix whatever's wrong with it. You're just kind of throwing something at the wall and hoping that it sticks. Whereas if you know the name of the tree, you can say, well, that is a grand fir. Now, I know this and that about grand firs, and that helps to get you a little bit further in terms of your diagnostics. And I think in the landscape, it's just as required to know a little bit more about the landscape, where you have kind of like a big machine that has 1 billion parts in it. And every time you look closer, each one of those parts has 1 billion parts inside of it. And if you can learn a couple of the larger parts and say, all right, that right there is this oak tree, that over there is this elm tree, that over there is a willow, and you just kind of start to get an idea of what those species are, then you can start to tell apart what's going on. Like, okay, I noticed this oak is growing over here in this area with that shape. I noticed this elm is growing over here in this area with that shape. And then you can start to notice the patterns across the landscape. Then when you notice the patterns of the big trees, the big things around, you can start to notice the patterns of all the small stuff that are coming along with it. One of the best things and most famous about the oak trees you guys have over in the UK is that they are just filled to the brim with insects and butterflies and all these other species that eat on the leaves. So now you can say, oh, well, that's an oak tree. I know to go that one if I want to find this kind of insect or this kind of thing, or maybe this kind of bird that eats this kind of insect. And now you're building like patterns onto patterns onto patterns. And humans are really good at looking at patterns. So if you are able to start to recognize even the name of a tree, in the sense that that's a fir versus a pine versus an elm or a linden or a lime, then you can start to build a mosaic, and you can walk around and you can say, okay, I can see everything and I know the differences. And I happen to know that over there is going to be a little bit wetter. Over there is going to be a little bit drier. And you can kind of put these things all together. In the urban landscape, it's a little bit different. Mostly my theme was, well, if you can identify that tree, then you're going to care about it. And you're going to be able to actually say, oh, I know the name of that tree. It's not just some random green thing here. And you're more inclined to support conservation efforts or be outraged when it's about to get cut down, that kind of thing. But I think in a less combative way, if you're out in the forest and you're looking for mushrooms, you're looking for anything, or you just want to have a little bit more knowledge rather than just a kind of passerby who just experiences it in a way that it's, affecting you subconsciously, certainly, and consciously most of the time. If you are able to just walk through and actually have a bit of a deeper connection, that walk's going to take a little bit longer because you're looking at every little thing and you're finding and noticing it all. And it makes for a more rich experience, in my opinion. And I think that richness is what makes life worth living, having rich and valuable experience around in anything. I just happen to focus on trees. And Alex likes to focus on food. He's one of the most food forward people I've met. So every time he's like, hey, here, this is good and this is why. And I'm like, okay. I would have just been like, give me the spaghetti, and just called it good.
Nice. Wow, there's so much in what you just said. I was thinking about how knowing stuff on a species level or in a kind of botany way can actually also support our maybe more emotional, more nature connected sort of personal response to an individual tree as well. As you were talking, I was sort of thinking, well, if you know a little bit about oak trees and the habitat they like, the conditions they like, as you're saying, the insects that they support, then having that knowledge about oaks in general might then support you, I think, in having a much more meaningful personal relationship with one particular oak that you pass a lot, or that you it's near your house, or because you feel it's almost like getting to know a person and getting to know bits about their personality. Yes. Because it can't tell you that, but if you know that stuff about it at a species level, I think that kind of gives you a bit of a deeper connection there. And I guess that's what I see that as part of our role as forest school practitioners with the groups that we're working with, is to kind of maybe offer these little bits of information as we either notice them or we've read about it or whatever, or listen to your podcast, and just offer these little things as kind of gateways to connect with trees in a more deep level. And you can still have, I don't believe that kills the magic of a maybe more spiritual connection with the tree, because you're still going to value that tree for what it might offer you in terms of it's really great to climb on this tree, or it offers really great shade, or it's a really comfy place to sit, or it gives great chestnuts that we can play with in autumn. You've still got that level of, I think you can have those two levels existing at the same time. I
agree entirely. I think in a particular sense, the way I describe it is, if you walk around and you're at a concert or something, you notice that there are just a couple hundred people there. You don't really notice any of them, but if you see a friend, then you're like, oh, there's Julie right over there. I'm going to go say hi to Julie. And you go find your friend. And the more you get to know your friend, the more the deeper your relationship becomes. And even if it's like, the tiniest little things about their lives, like, don't put the fork over there. They really hate that. And I think that this adds a little bit more. And I don't think that you ever get to the point where you're like, I know so much about this person and it ruined my relationship with them. It's now, it's not helpful, or it makes them uninteresting. I think that as you get to know your trees, just as you get to know your friends, even if it's an individual, you're like, no, that particular tree, I go walk by every day. I look at it and I know it, as a whole year's kind of worth of knowledge. I think that is just as helpful. And I always say, when you get to know these trees and you can walk around, you can recognize them the same way that you recognize an old friend or anything else. You're just like, oh yeah, there's that Douglas fir, still there, still kicking. So I think that I agree. I think that the deeper you get to know something, I mean, if you're interested in it, then it helps that. Or if you can find a way that you are interested in it, which is, a big part of our podcast, is finding that way that this tree that otherwise seems completely uninteresting actually has a really interesting story because it's related to this or like this or like this. The green ash, I think, is one of my favorites about that, because the whole story was about frogs and how the frogs were being affected by the lack of certain dead leaves in ponds because the ash borer, a invasive beetle, had killed off the ash trees around. So those ash trees were not putting the high quality forage in the ponds. So the tree frogs, or the spring peepers, were being affected in terms of their health because they preferred that forage over, say, the red maple that took its place. And then you can go back and find this, wow, okay, we're talking about this tree that's like, dime a dozen in most places. But then when you dive into it, you're like, yes, but look at all these like little ramifying relationships that it actually has. So you can find a way, I think, to make any tree interesting and make it more of a personal journey. At least that's what we try to do every now and then. Sometimes it doesn't work as well.
Do you think there's a thing that's like, because we've kind of talked there about like the individual relationship that you can have with a tree. Do you think that there's something that, because a lot of our work is like holding community spaces in spaces where there are already trees, so it's in a slightly different, because like when was just saying about that kind of botany understanding, but also the kind of play memories, or the it's almost like botany and ethnobotany, isn't it? I suppose those two levels.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's another bit as well in our job, which is like holding a community's relationship with the things. And that's one thing where I found it interesting, because I can hold that like a community can have a relationship with a tree, but I think that ends up being very individual. That results in the tree being an individual, because it's like, this is the giant sequoia, the one giant sequoia is the one that this community relates to. Or like we have the Robin Hood tree that was, it's a sycamore, so it was cut down, it's going to come back, it's all fine. But that's the one tree. It's not that as a community we've gone, oh, we love sycamores. It was that it was that tree, And so totally. I wonder if there's anything, and like, do you guys have any thoughts on that idea of like, can a And then I was trying to think, because Alex, I was thinking about your work and like writing music and stuff. And I was trying to think whether anyone's ever written a broad song about like, oh, I love all oak trees, or whether it culturally ends up being like, let me tell you about this fucking oak tree, and he's important, and here's why. And so, like, can a community do that thing, or does that have to be individual? That's quite a big question. I've just waffled a really big question. And
I was about to be like, yeah, Casey, you speak on that. I think it is more of a more romantic sort of thought to like, to have a relationship with one tree, like the idea you proposed of a song about all sycamore trees is very funny and sort of like, oh, that's odd. It's like
I think Rush did a song like that.
Did they really?
Yeah, they have a song called "The Trees," and it sounds a lot like something. It's a prog rock song that's all about Lord of the Rings, in my opinion.
Okay,
it's great. It's good. But it's a broad song. Like they're
well, look, if we want to go off on a tangent, I'm so sorry you've hit the special interest button there. Tolkien writes about specific trees, about totally the two trees, and about like the trees with the stars in them and all those things. Like he doesn't write broadly because that's not romantic. You can't write a history of a people and be like, and they all bloody loved oaks,
Yeah,
totally. Yeah, that was
a very particular name.
I actually just read The Lord of the Rings for the first time, front to back, after many failed attempts. And I was struck by how much, I mean, I joke with Casey that the Fellowship is mostly descriptions of hedges and like walking over hedges. There's so many fucking hedges. But then, like so many of there's a whole race of living, characters that are all trees, and there's Old Man Willow in the old forest. And I mean, there's so much tree content in those books. It was stunning. I loved it.
Yeah,
and the trees of what is it, Valinor, or the sun and the moon trees?
Yeah,
the whole basis for the creation myth of this world is based around trees.
Shall I just leave now?
Wem has gone so.
I'll say night
You can
night.
go.
Bye.
We're just going to
go
tee
get
off
my
for a
dinner
little bit.
now. And when the internet memory is full because you've uploaded so much content from this one conversation, then just let me know. Oh, God.
We'll send you a text.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll drag it back. I can get back in the little. Okay, put
Yeah.
that back in the
Well,
box.
I can speak to something based on this question, and one thing that comes to my mind is trees that have a certain meaning. And the kapok tree is a great example. It's the sadly now befallen because of a huge storm, but the cotton tree of Freetown in Sierra Leone. No, Sierra Leone. Yes, Sierra Leone. And it's at the time it was essentially a slave city, and it was just there so that people could take Africans from more interior and along the coast and send them off on the slave trade. And so they finally got their freedom and kind of pushed all these other people away. And in doing so, there's this one big tree that grew in the middle of Freetown, their city, and they just called it, here's the cotton tree of Freetown. And the tree itself was this really important symbol for the city and beyond the city to the whole country. So they would rally around it. And I think there's trees like that all over the whole world. But a lot of them we may not know about because, huge communities don't necessarily do it. But back when you would say, oh, yeah, we're just going to go meet underneath this oak tree. In the United States, they did that a lot over in the East on these certain large oaks. And then in the Sahara Desert, the Sahara cypress grows so far and few between that each one of them has a name or more or less a description where they would give directions. They would we'll go to the tree with a huge sweeping limb and kind of aim a little right and then keep going that way. And you'll see another group of trees. They're named this because they grow here. And then you keep going straight and you're going to find the spot you're going for. So I think that there are all these different levels of community use that they kind of just develop, I think, the community doesn't say we deem this so. It just kind of happens. Then afterwards they say, yes, we're gonna stamp this as official. But I think that creating that kind of connection with a tree that isn't all the trees, like not all the oaks. I think that happens way more than we actually quite think about. I think it's probably something, to me, it feels more innate to people. I think we're predisposed to want to go get and have a relationship with a certain tree. We want to go back to the same campsites all the time. We want to find that one amazing spot that we found with that one incredible tree. And just like the Robin Hood tree, like, it was in a movie in a place that everyone's like, aha, that is a really cool tree. And it got this je ne sais quoi for the, the community. And you can't write this. It's just like something on the internet. How do you go viral? It's like, wow, I don't really know. You just have to throw something at the wall, and then sometimes people will watch it 10 million times.
When you mentioned the Robin Hood tree, I was conflating it with the major oak in Sherwood Forest.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you said, and they cut it down, and I was like, no fucking way. And then I looked it up, and I thought, oh yeah, and now we did a whole episode about the Robin Hood tree.
Oak?
Yeah, well, there's a few.
Or did we not? Have we? Maybe we just talked about it for 5 seconds, and in my mind, that's like a long time. So that's a whole episode.
All right, stamp it. Let's go.
We mentioned it briefly once.
There's quite a few organisations in the UK that do kind of like historic tree of the year, and there's always a list of 10 trees, and they've always got the most like incredible names and stories, and some of them have got like cannonballs lodged in them from the Civil War, or like
that's incredible.
We have do you have money trees anywhere in the States? It's quite a big thing here where people will push thousands of penny. So you find these stumps or trees that are dead, and where you get these little fissures, people will push a coin into the crack.
Wow.
And there's one near me that easily 2,000 coins are in this stump.
Oh my God.
Where like a wishing well, but like but that's a real example of like, it's not like that people went, oh, it's because it's a beach and the beach is the lucky money. It's like that tree is the one we all stick our money in, and I'm not sure if come hard times we go cut the tree, but like, it's just this kind of, it's got, they've all got stories to them. And I that's one of the things that I find interesting when I'm listening to you guys' podcast is, so I really relate to stories of individual trees. I really like either a personal level of looking at like, well, that tree had to, look, it fell and then it's grown back up this way. And I can kind of read the story back of the tree of, what it grew in. But a lot of the time in the podcast, you guys anthropomorphize the species and talk about like, it wants to do this. It really hit me when you did the one about junipers, and you were talking about them being mislabeled as like invasive, and they're getting in the wrong place, and like you really anthropomorphize them as like they're just trying to do their thing. They're trying, like, it was a really earnest, anthropomorphizing of the species desires. Do you know what I mean? Is that something you kind of intentionally, when you were writing the notes or coming up with that episode, you go, oh, this is a story we can tell about the whole species' journey?
Yeah, and I definitely tried to do that. I don't know if I quite put it as a species journey. I think that's way better than what I've said. That actually I think is really a beautiful way to put it. But what we are trying to focus on that show in particular was the fact that a tree has a natural state that it does. Like a tree, a whole species, they have like this niche that they have found and that they exploit really well. And it's usually in balance with all the other things that are around them most of the time. And it is usually like a tree just has this ability. And when we don't like it, humans don't like whatever this tree is doing, we usually label it, some way with a negative epithet. Yet, really, it's just doing its thing. So invasive is a great example of this, where we brought a tree into a space and it is just doing its best, which is what it's always done its entire life. And now, because it's doing its best, it's like if you play basketball, you are 7 feet tall and everyone else around you is 5 feet tall. You're like, well, I am just doing my best, you guys. I'm sorry that I'm crushing you. And you can't really blame, the person for being 7 feet tall and being way better at this, height-based sport. So with trees, I think it's something similar. It's like, well, I can blame you because you're doing too well, but it's just doing its thing. It's just trying its best the way everything is, and we have put it into a place where we have taken the guardrails off of it, essentially.
That is something that I think subconsciously I think about a lot when we record episodes. When Casey brings a story in a tree, is like, who's the antagonist here? You know, like who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist, and sometimes it's humans. Sometimes it's completely emotion based. It's like a instinctual thing where I'm like, sometimes I just feel like humans are at fault for this tree being a pain in the ass, and sometimes I'm like, fuck that tree, that stupid, that selfish tree. Even though, like Casey said, you know, it's just doing its thing, but it sometimes does feel like the tree is just trying to be a nuisance.
Man, I can't wait to talk about the one we're going to be recording just after this. I can't wait to hear what your thoughts are. You guys, you should look it up and do your own research before it comes out. Here's a little sneak preview. It's called Nutsia floribunda, or the Australian Christmas tree.
Oh,
It's gonna be fun. I'm excited now that you said that, Alex. This is good. Yeah, Mujar.
I'm still reeling off. This morning I've been listening to the Herbum. Okay, how do I anglicize this?
Yeah, yerba mate.
Yerba.
And
But usually it's spelled with a Y, so you could just look right, and it's very phonetic that way.
Sure, but
We
that's a
messed with
holly
it on purpose.
But it's a holly, and I know hollies,
holly.
and I know, and I have hollies, and I have relationships with holly trees, and then this is a completely different holly, which is
Had no idea.
absolutely mad.
I am so glad that someone else has that same response. Like when I was talking with Alex, I think Alex was like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, it is a holly. Okay, that's interesting." And I'm like, "No, it's a holly. It's a holly."
Well, that was clearly too much, consumption of yerba mate as you're
Yeah,
recording,
exactly.
which is going through.
Yeah, we just got a little too high on all that caffeine.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Do you?
So I think it's caffeine.
I really wanted to ask you guys if you have, because like you say, you've done nearly 400 episodes. You've got all these species kind of logged. But do you guys have any from your like personal lives, maybe from your childhood or maybe from your like where you live now? Do you have any individual relationships with trees where you're like, that was really meaningful as a kid, or that's the one in my parents' back garden, or any relationships like that?
Yeah,
For sure. I mean, I'm sure Casey has a lot more than I do, but I in Portland in like 1996, Casey, the windstorm, we had a huge windstorm.
Oh yeah, I don't know if that was 96, but yeah, that was a giant flood that happened in 1996.
Okay.
But I know the windstorm you're thinking about. I think it was actually, it might have been around the same time. It doesn't matter.
But it was like a hurricane. It was I mean, as a child especially. But we had a huge Sitka spruce in our front yard. Again, I was a child. I don't know if it was that big, but I'm pretty sure it was fairly big. And we sat at the window and watched the base of the tree go like this, up out of the ground and come back down, and up out of the ground and come back down. We sat there for like 4 hours watching it, and then eventually it fell over. Thankfully, not on our house. It was like 15 feet away from our house. But that was devastating. We were all so sad because we loved that tree, and it just being like sort of the marker of our home. It's like, you could see it from down the hill. It's like, there's our house. That, and then like, I had a tree house, which is really like a platform of plywood with a ladder going to it.
That's the best tree houses.
Yeah, it's the easiest ones.
We had grand visions, and then all we could do was, nailed some plywood into the top of this tree. But yeah, that tree was really great. And then any tree that has given me fruit, I feel like an immense gratitude for, because I love fruit. But yeah, Casey, what about you?
I have a few trees. Yeah, it's honestly, a lot of them are trees that I have somehow ran into with work. There are a few that I do different tree walks around that aren't really related to something other than that. But like a really big personal relationship is usually a tree that I worked really hard to save is generally the ones that I have the most connection to, I remember most distinctly, and I can find my way to. Like, just I'm going to the grocery store, yet somehow I always pass that tree, even though it's not on the way, that kind of thing. And one is it's called the Overlook Oak, and it was a huge deal because it's a 54, at least at the time. This is probably 4 or 5 years ago. It was it is a 54-inch Oregon white oak, which is our Western North American species. It's the only big one that grows north of kind of halfway through the state of Oregon on the West Coast. It's the only big one that grows. It's the only native one. And it has grows natively out on this bluff area in Portland. And this tree was going to have development go right up next to it. It's a heritage tree in Portland. And so based on the size, and people kind of did some measurements and some guesses, and they said, well, if we just kind of do some estimations here, this tree is probably between 200 and 250 years old, which makes it older than the city of Portland itself. So if that shows you, how old that tree is compared to where you guys are at, it's not too much it's not too big of a deal. But over here, I think I can count maybe 2 or 3 that I can think of that I'm like, I bet you that one is just as old. Everything else has been cut down and has not been allowed to, regrow in the same way, or at least it hasn't had the time.
And I linked a photo of the Overlook Oak in the chat if you guys are interested.
Nice, there you go.
It's an extremely small, tiny little picture, but if you zoom in, you can see it.
Yeah, and you can also find it online a few times. But who would ever just look up this random tree except me and Alex? So there was this huge. I was at the time a tree inspector at the city, so I was managing our trees in development for certain places.
That's a nice tree.
It's a good one.
It's just so perfect. It's can easily grow for another 300 years if we just let it sit there. And so this is they wanted to make too close a development to it, and the neighborhood got involved, and I was kind of in the middle with the city because I have to do certain regulations. They have certain rights as property owners, yet at the same time everyone's like, don't let them cut down this tree. And it's like, first off, they're not going to cut down this tree, but I'm going to make this rule that is kind of like, okay, you can't come within this distance. That's my job. So I made that rule, and everyone was unhappy with it. And I have since learned more about the developer, and I don't really like the guy. He's got a couple other projects that he has, and he's just there to make money. He lives right next to this tree and is trying to develop the land next to his house that he bought from a woman who lived there for, I don't know, decades, and she basically said, yeah, this is a heritage tree. I'm writing this in on the deed. You can't cut that tree down. Now here's your land. Do as you please. So
by the way, I'm imagining this developer is from like the villain from like an 80s movie where he's like, he wears snakeskin boots and he's like aviator sunglasses and wants to build a mall.
Oh, I see. I had a big curly mustache.
Oh, that's
and
good
like
too.
A very long cigarette holder thing.
Oh, like a Texas oil baron. Yeah. Good.
That's perfect. Everyone put that in your imagination. So this guy, they just really wanted to push through this development, and I said, you can't come within 1 foot per each inch of the diameter, 54 inches. They wanted to come way in and cut a bunch of low branches, like kind of ruin the whole part of the tree. And then the neighborhood did a bunch of work, and they said, no, you actually shouldn't come within 1.5 feet of this tree. And it just kept going higher and higher above me in the kind of city bureaucracy.
And now the whole city has to move because it's too close.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You got to move everything about this and make it a completely different situation. But at the end of the day, the tree's still there and it's still doing great, and they still have not got any closer with their development. Yet I haven't worked for the city for some years. And every time I do a tour through this tree or through this section of the neighborhood, because it's got a bunch of really beautiful trees, I always go and tell the story about this tree. And so it's actually going to be on the front of my new tree ID book that I'm coming out with. There's some friends that are hugging it. And I have trespassed on that property so many times just to go walk and sit underneath that tree, because it's like a really intense experience, because the whole comes down around you all the way to the ground. And I did that with a group of people, and we got in trouble afterwards. And so I haven't done it since. But it's just one of those trees that I'm like, yeah, I'm willing to just go and just put everything out for this tree, because it's so much more worth it than a new development, which, by the way, isn't going to be, housing for anyone else. It's going to be like a multi-million-dollar development, because it's right on a bluff overlooking the river and the West Hills and everything. Like,
Right.
The neighborhood didn't save the tree because they really love the tree. They saved the tree
Right.
because they really like the tree and they like their views more.
So have you guys seen the thing that they're doing in Australia now?
No.
With trees? Oh, okay. Hang on. I have to get something out of my head, and then I will come back to this. So, Alex, you talking about your tree falling down and being sad about it? Did you know that owls have a noise that they make when their chicks die, and they also make the same noise when family, because they use the same roosts for generations, and if the tree falls down, they make the same noise. They make a like grief noise. So you and the owls can have a little like tree fell down grief
Fabulous.
noise.
Oh my God.
That's
Okay,
amazing.
I got that out of my head. In Australia, they have started putting, if people, because again, developers, especially in some parts of Australia, big money to be made. They're cutting down these huge trees, and whatever the height of the tree was, they're putting a huge billboard in place of the tree when it gets cut down that says like, a tree was cut down here. The law was broken. Da, 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 da. And the idea is, one, that you don't get the view, but two, that you have just fucked off all your neighbors. So everyone around you is like, do not cut that tree, because there will legally there will be a billboard there for 10 years, and we do not want that. That's a really
incredible.
interesting thing.
I have to look that up. That is fascinating. That's
Wow.
fabulous.
I mean, that's like real accountability, right? Like,
there was a tree. There was, so where I grew up, there's a coastal town called Bournemouth, and again, seafront, loads of big things that people would be like, oh, I'm just gonna cut this down because then I can see the sea and that'll be lovely. And someone cut a load of trees that were maybe 40, 50 foot tall, so that their house could have the view. And the council decided that they had to replace them with nursery trees of the same height, and they had to, whatever that cost was, they had to incur it.
wow.
Yeah, with the big machine that comes in from like four sides.
Oh yeah.
You probably know the
tree
thing that goes.
spade,
Yeah,
it's exactly it's what it needs to. There's another situation I worked with in Seattle where they had, the city went to the property and they figured out who did it, and they said, you are now required, or we're going to actually get your property reassessed with this new beautiful view. And they sued them for all the costs of the work that needed to be done to kind of clean up the mess. And then they sued them for the increased value in their property based on their new view that wasn't there before because there were kind of trees in the way. So they really went down in everything. But, you know, in a lot of places, that's just, Alex and I talked about this a couple weeks ago. It's just the cost of doing business sometimes, where everyone's like, well, okay, great. I will pay that because now I have this great view, and that's really what I value.
Yeah.
Which is, I'm sure you guys teaching about trees and about forest things in a smaller island country that is packed full of people, that the value goes way up for your non-urban resources, where a lot of places in the United States, everyone's like, wow, there's so much room. There's forests over there. There's trees over there. Yeah. So I wonder if you guys would have a similar experience out here where the value like is just different. Where you're like, well, we can't just keep expanding. We can't keep moving out. We've gone as far as we can go, and we can't lose these trees, because if we do, there's no other place for them to grow.
We're the least forested country in Europe.
Really?
I was going to say
by percentage.
Yeah.
By percentage, wow.
But we
of
are like
land area.
So yeah, like a percentage of the land. How much of it is forest? Out of all the European countries, we are like leaps and bounds below everybody else.
And there's some big stuff in the media recently about a big train line that they've wanted to build to connect London and the north, and it was going through so much ancient woodland and loads of campaigns, and then obviously loads of different bits that ran out of money and things, but they've already smashed up loads of woodland, and all these arguments about whether you can replace that, and trying to educate people on the difference between ancient woodland and just planting trees. It's like, oh, it's okay, we'll just replace those. It's like, it's not quite the same, actually. That ecosystem has been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and it's entire it's an ecosystem. It's not just a bunch of trees. So it's something that comes up a lot. And I think, people understand, going back to that kind of personal connection thing, people understand if a tree that they personally love is cut down, they're like, oh, that's such a shame, or that's so sad. But there's less, I think, cohesive action or understanding about like, oh, just trees being cut down, you know, and not much public awareness about how trees are used economically either. I don't think, you know, we've got quite a lot of plantations and most people aren't really aware of how those things function and the difference between that and established ancient woodland. It's all just trees, you know.
Totally.
Yeah.
Oh, guys, I could genuinely chat, I know, for hours and hours and hours, but I'm conscious of not taking up too much time. So, just to go back to Lord of the Rings. No.
Thank you. Let's do it.
Guys, thank you so much for chatting with us. Yeah, it's been amazing. Thank you so much for the podcast. People that have listened to this and are like, yeah, I want to listen to more of this stuff. Where can people find out about you guys' work, your different projects, all those things?
Yeah, your book and stuff.
I'll let Alex start. He's the one who has this professionally down.
Oh, sure. I got the muscle memory of saying arbortrarypod.com, ARBORTRARY pod.com is where you can find, that's the hub of everything we do. Or if you just search for Completely Arbortrary, even if you spell arbitrary,
yes,
in the traditional, yes, it will redirect you. We're so proud of that. We had no idea how it
really
happened.
Google figured it out.
But yeah, we're on all the podcast apps, and if you end up liking our show, we have a Treemium membership that you can join.
We're still recording that with you, Lewis, just to be clear.
And get lots of fun things, including, you know, stickers and you know, ad-free listening and all that good stuff. But we're also just happy to have you listen to the show for free anywhere you find it.
Oh, thank you so much.
You can also find us on Instagram. It's where we do most of our talking, but that's also where you can find Alex and I doing independent stuff. I just wrote a book about trees. It's about tree identification, which is probably going to be useless for most of the people over in the UK. But I bet you actually might have probably 50% of the trees in common. I would be willing to bet. Yeah. They're just kind of all the same everywhere half the time, certainly in the northern hemisphere. So I bet you'd be pretty good for at least some of your cities.
Cool.
So if you want it, just let you know.
When is the book out? The book's not out quite yet, is it?
No, it's going to be coming out in August of 2025. So we got about 9 months yet. So if anyone decides to get pregnant right now, you can name your child after my book because they'll be born at the same time.
What? Has the book got a name?
Yeah, and then what's that?
Has the book got a name?
It does. It's called The Trees Around You. And what is this? The subtitle is The Trees Around You, How to Identify Common Neighborhood Trees of the Pacific Northwest.
Someone will name their kid that.
Someone will name their
They'll have
kid
to
that.
write it real small on the birth certificate.
Exactly. If they ever have those forms that have individual boxes, it's going to be awful. They're not going to be able to do it. But yeah, so that comes out in August. I'm very much looking forward to it, and it teaches everyone how to identify trees from start to finish, and then how to identify particular species, about 340 of them, with all the different little bells and whistles on how to kind of cheat your way to figure that out, but also do it 100% the old-fashioned way. So trying to make it as easy as possible to get people, like we talked about today, to build that relationship, however that is. Maybe you're a logger and you need to figure out which tree you're cutting down. This is your book. Or, well, maybe not a logger, but maybe an arborist, where you can be able to figure out how to identify the trees you're managing. And then, and Alex also puts out a lot of new records and music all the time. At least plays shows around here. I think he's in 4 bands last time I counted.
Yeah, I've got a couple of records out there on Spotify and Apple Music under my name, Alex Crowson.
Oh, amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you both.
So
Really
enjoyable.
appreciate it. We just sent off your stickers, by the way. So.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Forest School Podcast. If you enjoyed it and want to help us grow, there are a few simple things you could do. First, leave us a review. It really makes a difference and helps other like-minded people discover the podcast. Second, share this episode with a friend, a colleague, or someone you think might enjoy joining in with the conversation. Word of mouth, honestly, is the way the podcasts live or die. And lastly, if you haven't already, make sure to follow or subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes. We're so grateful for your support, and we love hearing from our listeners. So do reach out to us on social media or through our website and let us know your thoughts. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode. Stay wonky.